Hare Krishna. Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Jaya Shri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jai Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivrajacharya Stotra Shada Shri Srimad Abhaya Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivrajacharya Stotra Shada Shri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupada Srila Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupada Srila Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur Ki Jai. Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupada Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Shri Guriya Vaishnav Guru Varga Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Shri Krishna's Kaviraj Thakur Ki Jai. Shri Caitanya Caritamrita Ki Jai. Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Nitai Gaura Premanande Hari Hari Bol. All glories to Hare Krishna. All glories to Hare Krishna. All glories to Hare Krishna. All glories Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Vacha Patita Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So, welcome back to Shri Caitanya Caritamrita class. Today we are going to be continuing on our discussions, the building up the moments prior to the speaking of the Rai Ramananda Samvad. Today we will finally begin the first of the 4 questions which compose the Rai Ramananda Samvad. But before getting to that, we still have a few preliminary details to discuss. As we have established over the past few sessions, we have been talking about the nature and identity of Sri Ramananda Rai and how he relates to Mahaprabhu and how that relationship and how those identities give this conversation the elevated status that it does. First, we began to discuss one form in Krishna Lila, which is the form of Vishakha, especially in light of the comparisons that are sometimes made between Vishakha and Lalita. Then we discussed the actual form in Gaur Lila of Ramananda Rai, specifically in light of his role of being considered of a lower caste, and how that sort of is a recurring theme within our parampara. And again, also we touched a little bit upon how that actually practically means nothing to disqualify his ontological status as a devotee. A theme which we will go much more deeper into as we discuss the first answer given to Mahaprabhu's first question in the Rai Ramananda Samvad. And I think there is an important point to be taken there, that it is Mahaprabhu's question. As we can infer from the name, the Rai Ramananda Samvad is a samvad, it is a conversation. Vad, we know, there's Mayavad, there's Shunyavad, there's also Bhaktivad, one could say. And Vad refers to as is referring to speech. Vadati. And the prefix sam, we know Sankirtan is kirtan that is done together. Kirtan is glorification, and Sankirtan is glorification done together. And Sankirtan obviously has such great value because of that. What is greater than Kirtan is doing Kirtan, performing Kirtan, chanting in Kirtan in the company of the Vaishnavas. So Sankirtan or Samkirtan is Kirtan together. So Vad, referring to speech, and then Samvad is speech together or a conversation. So in this conversation, we were discussing in regards to the Mangala Charan that this conversation is one in which Rai Ramananda instructs Mahaprabhu. Why? Because Mahaprabhu is asking questions. And this is an interesting segue into the third discussion of the identity of Ramananda Rai. Not that we can ever exhaustively discuss the depths of such an elevated personality, but as a general overview of this individual. And that third identity is one that is given by Mahaprabhu himself in the Caitanya Lila. Ramananda Rai's father, Bhavananda Rai, was met by Mahaprabhu, and Mahaprabhu, upon meeting him, said, well, surely you are Pandu, and your 5 sons are the Pandavas. And so, respectively, we can say that these children were all forms of the Pandavas in Gaur Lila. However, specific notice is to be made that Rai Ramananda is Arjuna. This is the specific one of the Pandavas, the specific son of Pandu, that the son of Bhavananda Rai took the form of. And Arjun is very famous. We were discussing about the Samvad, the conversation of Ramananda Rai. However, if we take note of Ramananda Rai's identity as Arjuna, we will know, again, because he is very famous for it, that this is not the first Samvad with Bhagavan that Arjuna or Ramananda Rai has been engaging in. Of course, we know the famous Bhagavad Gita, that great text, that great foundational work of the Vedanta and of all of the various Vedic schools, following in that Vedantic tradition, which is the great predominant tradition of the Vedic schools. That great text was a conversation by Krishna with Arjuna. However, the rasa was a little different there. In the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, we know so famously, Arjuna, he is dejected on the battlefield. He is very, very much distraught. And in this distraught state, Arjuna, he is feeling all of these emotions well up. He doesn't know what to do. We know, Karpanya dosho pahatasva bhavaha. This famous text. And so he is in a very miserly condition, and he simply surrenders unto Krishna. And he asks a series of questions. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur enumerates them I forgot now how many there are, but he asks a certain set amount of questions. And Krishna, so mercifully, because, as we know, Arjuna has taken shelter of him as his disciple, so mercifully elaborates upon them and gives that wonderful essence of transcendental knowledge that is the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So we find here is a samvad, a conversation. Arjuna is asking the questions and he is being enlightened by Krishna. However, this samvad is different, as we have already discussed. In this samvad, it is Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu who is asking questions of Arjuna. And it is Arjuna who is enlightening Krishna. The roles have been reversed. And so Mahaprabhu, who is Krishna himself, and Ramananda Rai, who is Arjuna himself, have done a little flipping around. And in this we find something even higher than the Bhagavad Gita. Srila Prabhupada writes in one of the purports of Srimad Bhagavatam that Bhagavad Gita is mainly engaged in the ideal of engaging one's intelligence in spiritual life. Bhagavad Gita is mainly on the platform of engaging one's intelligence, and Granth-raj Srimad Bhagavatam is on the platform of engaging one's soul. So we see that Bhagavad Gita here, it is giving some sort of preliminary knowledge. However, that is not to say later on, by the mercy of our great acharyas, Bhagavad Gita really does contain virtually everything, as has been extracted by our great acharyas. But that is not exactly what we see here in Rai. That is not exactly explicit as it is here. And there is a significance, there is a reason why what we find in the Rai Ramanana Samvad is so much higher. Because it is spoken by a devotee and not by Krishna. The Bhagavad Gita, we know a very common translation for it is that it is the Song of God, or the Song of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bhagavan, and then it is his Gita. But in a sense, if we can say that the Gita is the song of Bhagavan, in many ways we can say that this Rai Ramananda Samvad is also a Gita. And this Gita is that of the Bhagavat, rather than of the Bhagavan, but of the Bhagavat, the person devotee who is completely infatuated with the Supreme Lord. And so this is higher. This is going a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit beyond the conceptions which we have prior established in Bhagavad Gita. For the reasons that were explained when we were discussing the commentary, the Mangalacharan. So this Bhagavad Gita is giving very many nice things, and it is being spoken by Krishna to a dejected human being, trying to find out what is the perfection of my life, or rather, what should I do, or rather, more deeply, who am I? Because that is, of course, the central concern of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita has been spoken addressing that grand question of, if I am not my friends and family, if I am not them, if they perish, then who am I? This was the root of Arjuna's distress. And he was thinking, well, who am I then? What does it truly mean to be Arjuna if I do this thing, and therefore I should not do it? Do I really need to execute Kshatriya Dharma like this? Can I not just go and take sannyas? What is the problem with me doing these things? Because again, I do not know who I am, independent of these people. And so Krishna illuminates to the individual, to the person, this is who you truly are. And by doing so, he unveils the true heart of what everyone is, a devotee. Because we know the highest instruction, the highest teaching of Bhagavad Gita, its actual conclusive teachings are that of devotion, which speak entirely to the soul. However, the Bhagavad Gita is spoken in this context. And then we continue on to the Bhagavatam, which Srila Prabhupada, as I said in that purport, says is a text mainly dealing with the platform of the soul. And on this platform of the soul, we hear something a bit greater. We hear Krishna still speaking in a sense, although Shukadev speaking and all, but it is a literary form of Krishna. And we find, however, now a greater emphasis being spoken regarding the devotees of Krishna. Here in Bhagavatam, we are starting to relish that devotion which Krishna begins to, in a very nutshell, discuss in Bhagavad Gita. And it's starting to open up. What does it look like for these people to be engaged in that devotion? What does sarva dharman parityajya? What does this practically look like? What happens when this Shuddha Bhakti walks? What happens when it talks? What happens when it sings? And in its highest form, the thing that happens is Vrindavan Dham. However, this is what Bhagavatam is doing. Bhagavatam is illuminating this highest point, this highest conception of the Bhagavad Gita and unpacking it, delivering the nectar of these final conclusive teachings in an even greater and finalized way. And so this is the glory of Bhagavatam, and this is why it speaks directly to the soul. It is not speaking of a ladder of various Mishra Bhaktis, of various other mixed forms of devotion which allow one to progressively reach a point at which they can be purely devoted. No, the Bhagavatam is there to put straight into one's face, this is pure devotion. That is not to say that every individual is practicing pure devotion. We know, of course, Dhruva Maharaj doing some sort of yoga Mishra Bhakti, if you will, with all sorts of desires. However, the run of the text is so as to make sure that one does not miss the central point. However, in Caitanya Caritamrita, we can find a level even beyond that. We can find a level not beyond in value, but maybe beyond in explicitness, or in another sense, beyond in value. Maybe not value for us, but in the intensity of the concentrated nectar that it is distributing. Because here in Caitanya Caritamrita, here in this page, in these pages, that devotee who had asked Krishna for instruction is now being approached by Krishna himself. Because all these other considerations are now done away with, and now Krishna himself has come to ask the questions. And Krishna asking these questions now hears them from a devotee. Who can ask better questions than the Supreme Lord? And who can and if the Supreme Lord needs to know something, then how high must this knowledge be? Before, it was a devotee speaking, and then Krishna was speaking of his realization, but now Krishna is asking for some realization that even he does not have, and therefore he's hearing it from the devotee. And therefore, now we are finding in this a something even beyond the glorification of those devotees. Something beyond those devotees asking Krishna, but Krishna instead begging from his devotees an understanding of what is the heart of that devotion that we see in Srimad Bhagavatam. Krishna lived Srimad Bhagavatam. The Bhagavad Purana is all about Krishna's devotees. And we know Srila Prabhupada so often mentions in all of his books, especially in that sweet purport I was mentioning earlier in Bhagavad Gita chapter 8, text 14, that the Supreme Lord is wherever his devotee is, and wherever Krishna is, the devotees are always there as well. The devotee can never forget Krishna, and Krishna can never forget the devotee. So, being there all the time, Krishna, he has been there with his devotees throughout the entirety of the Bhagavat Purana, the chronicles of his great devotees. And Krishna lived through the Bhagavatam. And Krishna enacted all those pastimes with all his devotees. And living through that, Krishna then began to wonder. He began to wonder about the nature of his devotees. He said, I saw them walk before me, I saw them love me, I saw them do all these things, and I have some knowledge of their devotion, but even I do not know what this is, so I must learn more. And then we come again to this final point of Krishna begging his devotee to teach him, to explain to him, what is it? What is it truly? What is the essence? What is the nature? What is the realization of that wondrous devotion which I have glorified in Bhagavad Gita, which we have seen walk and dance and sing in the Bhagavatam? What is it? Please tell me now. And that is what Rai Ramananda Sambad is. Ramananda Rai is also described as being another form, somewhat related to Arjun, of a gopi named Arjunia Gopi, who was a gopi in Vrindavan, which is why we can justify, we know Arjuna, he is not having so much the rasa, the rasa of the highest Vrindavan gopis. However, he does taste it in that other form, which is how he is able to speak on those things. We know that when Arjun saw the universal form, he began to think, hey Yadav, hey Krishna, hey Saketi, how could I have associated with you like a friend? We spent such times together so intimately. Now I realize all your opulence. When seeing the opulence of Krishna, Arjuna, he becomes scared away. But the gopis, when they were chasing after Krishna and Krishna would appear in his four-armed form, they would bow down to that Supreme Personality of Godhead and they would say, hey, do you know where Krishna went? We're trying to find him. So there is some difference in the rasa, and obviously that second rasa is so much higher, so much purer, and so much sweeter. Not to say that the first rasa is not infinitely perfect and infinitely worshipable itself. So because of his other form as a gopi, we are Arjunia Gopi, and of course because Ramananda Rai is also Vishaka Gopi, he's able to speak of these things. However, there is this great significance in that we can really see that line of thought of pursuing transcendence, which begins in Bhagavad Gita, which teaches the ABCs, the foundational and yet ever so valuable knowledge of that Bhagavad Gita, that train of thought, which then continues through Bhagavatam. We know Bhagavatam begins at the end of the Kurukshetra war, now finds its final conclusion in the Caitanya Caritamrita. And as we begin a discussion, as we begin our discussion of the actual conversation itself, I will speak a little bit more about how this Rai Ramananda Sambad very much is deeply entwined with the Bhagavad Gita. We can see clearly how it is entwined with the Bhagavatam. It will be speaking of the gopis and all these high ideals. And so it is not a stretch of the intelligence in order to identify how it ties into Bhagavatam. But how it ties into Bhagavad Gita can be somewhat missed. And therefore we'll pull out a bit of its deep connections to that text as well. So, with that sort of pretense, we will then continue the final few verses before beginning this conversation. So, we finished last time discussing the nature of the renunciate and how the renunciate in his renunciation will go often apparently begging, as if he is in need of anything. However, actually, it is all the people he is begging from who are in need of something. And his begging is therefore the true altruistic work. The people who benefit from that are not the sadhus, but the recipients of the sadhus' apparent begging. And so we will continue the discussion that Ramananda Rai has regarding this topic, because he discusses and quotes a text from Granth Raj Srimad Bhagavatam, 8th chapter of the 10th canto, text 4. My dear Lord, sometimes great saintly persons go to homes of householders, although these householders are generally low-minded. When a saintly person visits their homes, one can understand that it is for no other purpose than to benefit the householders. And then text 41 of this 8th chapter of Madhya Lila. Along with me there are about 1,000 men, including the Brahmins, and all of them appear to have had their hearts melted simply by seeing you. Here we find the mercy of Mahaprabhu. Even those Brahmins who were somewhat critical because they could not truly grasp the significance of what they were seeing, even they, upon seeing Mahaprabhu, even though they were held to be outsiders, still they received some mercy and their hearts were melted. This is the radiant sun of Mahaprabhu, burning away all of the anarthas and coldness in our hearts. Truly, if we simply pray and chant and approach Mahaprabhu in his merciful form, we know in order to be qualified to enter into Madhya Lila, to enter into the higher things of Golok, we need to first desire. This is a common teaching. First deserve, then desire. However, His Grace Indra Prabhu was once meditating upon this, and his realization was that what does it mean to deserve? And what does it mean to observe? According to his realization, what it means to deserve is to desire enough. Because when we desire enough, all the other nonsense desires we have will dissipate away in comparison, and therefore we will be deserving. But how can we even desire enough? How can we desire enough to be in a way that is in any way appropriate? And here we see, by surrendering to the feet of Mahaprabhu, by praying to him, by having darshan of him, by associating with him through his merciful pastimes and his merciful devotees. And what can happen? Even those who have had their hearts rigidly frozen up by the rules and regulations of Vedic tattva and Vedic regulations, even they can have their hearts melted. And so, what is the description of these people who have now had their hearts melted away from all these things? Krishna Krishna nama shuni shobar bodone, shobar ongo pulokito oshro noyone. I hear everyone chanting the holy name of Krishna. Everyone's body is thrilled with ecstasy, and there are tears in everyone's eyes. My dear sir, according to your behavior and bodily features, you are the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is impossible for ordinary living beings to possess such transcendental qualities. And so we hear this wonderful glorification, this wonderful glorification of Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And then Mahaprabhu, he replies to this beautiful glorification. And he says something very sweet. He says, "Sir, you are the best of the topmost devotees. Therefore, simply the sight of you has melted everyone's heart." And so we get this point. Maybe we cannot see Mahaprabhu. Maybe we cannot have association with Mahaprabhu. And maybe we cannot have our hearts melted by him because even Mahaprabhu is too far away for us conditioned souls, even though he is Patita Pavana, even though he has come so mercifully in this Kali Yuga, maybe even he is too far away for us to approach to have our hearts melted, and therefore how can we ever get any taste or any desire in order to deserve the great goals that are being offered to us, and they are being offered to us. It is not something that should be avoided. How can we be able to have our hearts melted in such a way that we can approach such high things if even Mahaprabhu, when we take darshan of the murti of Mahaprabhu, if even then, even though we know so much better deep down in our hearts, we think we see only rock because our hearts are so cold to the genuine conclusions of devotion, what do we do then? And Mahaprabhu says very sweetly, the sight of the topmost devotee, because of that, everyone's heart has melted. And in actuality, Mahaprabhu is speaking in one sense out of humility, saying it is not just seeing me, but in another sense, he is speaking only the truth. How beautiful, how radiant are the devotees of the Supreme Lord. And how merciful are they that when we, so unfortunate souls, cannot take advantage of the merciful glance of Mahaprabhu and Krishna, that they appear and they walk before us. The sadhus' pastimes are completely composed of mercy. I remember Jananivas Prabhu was once giving a class, and he was speaking about His Holiness Pujyapad Srila Jayapataka Swami Maharaj. And he said there is a very special thing when one sees His Holiness Jayapataka Maharaj. Because when one sees Jayapataka Maharaj, one sees a person who does not breathe even a single fraction of a breath for any purpose other than to give mercy and to serve the conditioned souls of Kali Yuga and the Vaishnavas. In Jayapataka Swami, every single moment is there either to give mercy to the fallen souls or to serve the devotees. There is no other desire being had, and therefore even his breathing, we can say even our breath should be used in the service of Krishna, even our breath should be used in the service of Vaishnavas. We can say these things, but can we realize them? There's a very, very long distance between those two things, between knowing some vague idea of what we should do and actually having realized it and therefore practicing it. But it is the mercy that the great devotees who have realized this continue their pastimes, continue to involve us in their pastimes in such a way that our hearts may be melted. And that is, in so many ways, their Lila, their Kripa Lila, to manifest the Kripa, the mercy of the Supreme Lord on earth. And so it is mercy which saturates every bit of their movement. And it is us fallen, conditioned Kali Yuga souls who are the great beneficiaries of it. And if we are to have any ounce of intelligence, and we can only pray to have such intelligence, we should take advantage of the association of such Vaishnavas, that our hearts too may be melted, and therefore we may begin to be appropriately attached to Srimad Bhagavatam, to the holy name, and to all these things that we so often can wonder why our hearts are so cold towards. So continuing this, Mahaprabhu, now he speaks from full humility. Now he is speaking things coming from the platform of his intense Vaishnav simplicity. Although I am a Mayavadi sannyasi, a non-devotee, I am also floating in the ocean of love of Krishna simply by touching you. And what to speak of others? Sarvabhaum Bhattacharya knew this would happen, and thus to rectify my heart, which is very hard, he asked me to meet you. In this way, each of them praised the qualities of the other, and both of them were pleased to see each other. At this time, a Brahmin Vaishnav, following the Vedic principles, came and offered obeisances. He fell flat before Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and invited him for lunch. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu accepted the invitation, knowing the Brahmin to be a devotee, and slightly smiling, he spoke as follows to Ramananda Rai. I wish to hear from you about Lord Krishna. Indeed, my mind is inclined to desire this. Therefore, I wish to see you again. So, he went off and he spoke this, and we'll quickly hear Ramananda Rai's response in a second. However, there's an interesting point to be made. Because Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu accepted the invitation of the Brahmin, why? Not because he was a Brahmin. It does not say that because Mahaprabhu understood that this person was a Brahmin, therefore he went and was very happy to go. Therefore he accepted the invitation. No, because he knew the Brahmin to be a devotee. This theme is very much leading up to the first question of the Rai Ramananda Samvad, the superiority, or rather the only qualification, the only adhikar, the only necessity of spiritual life is to be a Vaishnav, not anything else. And in fact, the implication of this is that we should be very careful with association. We may see some people, they are good people, they're vegetarian, maybe they are Hindu or something or another, maybe they are better than Hindu, abiding by some proper Vedic understandings, maybe they are all these things, but if they are not Vaishnav, then we should follow the thought process of Mahaprabhu and think maybe their association is not so valuable. Mahaprabhu valued this Brahmin's association because he was a Vaishnav. And there should be a similar thought process of our own. So anyways, so accepting this, however, Mahaprabhu said, I wish to hear from you about Lord Krishna, and we have spent quite a few hours now discussing why Ramananda Rai is the person who Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wishes to hear about Krishna from. Why Krishna wants to hear from Arjuna about Krishna. And Ramananda Rai said, My Lord, although you have come to correct me, a fallen soul, my mind is not yet purified simply by seeing you. Please stay for 5 or 7 days and kindly cleanse my polluted mind. After that much time, my mind will certainly be pure. Although neither could tolerate separation from the other, Ramananda Rai nonetheless offered his obeisances to Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and departed. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu then went to the house of the Brahmin who had invited him and took his lunch there. When the evening of that day arrived, both Ramananda Rai and the Lord were eager to meet each other again. After finishing his evening bath, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu sat down and waited for Ramananda Rai to come. Then Ramananda Rai, accompanied by one servant, came to meet him. I remember a pastime of my revered spiritual master, His Holiness Radha Govinda Das Goswami Maharaj. He was once speaking to a person, and this person recognized him that he was a ISKCON devotee. And speaking to him, Guru Maharaj heard from him. This person said, "Oh, you guys." And and almost when I heard this pastime, I was expecting, oh, you know, you guys either you're the book religion or you're the kitchen religion is a common thing. But he told Guru Maharaj, he said, oh, you guys are the bathing religion. You like to bathe so much. And here we see Mahaprabhu did the same. Cleanliness is good, not because we are obsessed with the body, not because we are caring actually about our body at all, but because we are offering up our body in service to Krishna. And therefore, in the same way, we would not use dirty utensils. We do not offer the bhoga on a plate which we have eaten off, or which is soiled. You know, the pujaris will wear clean clothing items. They will not wear dirty things. In the same way, we should also keep our body clean, not to please ourselves, but to please Krishna. And so, Ramananda Rai approached Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and offered his respectful obeisances, and the Lord embraced him. Then they began to discuss Krishna in a secluded place. And now we are just about to begin. We are just about to begin the Rai Ramananda Samvad, which we have been building up to for quite a while, this heart of the Caitanya Caritamrita. And just before we begin, there is one final consideration before we hear that first question. And what is that? Because what do we hear? Namaskar koilo Rai, Prabhu koile alingone, Dui jone Krishna kotha koi roho sthane. So after giving his obeisance, after all these things, where was it that these two, these Dui jone, where did they go to discuss Krishna Katha, Krishna Kothar Koi? It was in a rahasthane, in a very secluded place. Because these discussions that we are about to hear, as I have been pushing and pressing this whole time, are very elevated. They are the highest conception. And so we should know, we should know that what is about to be entered into is a very secret thing. This is the very secret and confidential knowledge. And therefore, what happened? They went away into a secluded place. I'm reminded of one pastime. One devotee, he was once invited. He was invited to a Shivratri festival. And he was under the impression that it was a Vaishnav Shivratri festival. So he went. And then at one point he realized, wait a second, that's not Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur on the altar. That's Ram Krishna. And he realized he was in the company of a Mayavad group. By some mistake, by some great severe misfortune, he was having the terrible association of the worshippers of Ram Krishna and other various Mayavadis. And so, but with this, however, he decided now, I've been asked to speak because they said, please speak something. And so he spoke. He was not so senior a devotee. And he spoke about Shiva Ratri. And what did he discuss? He discussed how Shiva desired to enter into the Ras Lila. And he was speaking all these things. He was speaking about the esoteric desire of the gopis, the Ras Lila, how Shiva himself was not qualified to enter and how he was given that form to guard the Ras Lila. And all these things, how he had taken the form of a gopi and speaking this very high rasikatha. He finished all of this. And after it was done, he spoke later and he told his spiritual master about it. And his spiritual master began to speak very heavy words. He said, you're in the company of Mayavadis. Even among devotees, we do not speak of such high things so freely. You are meant to smash their impersonalistic conceptions. This is the appropriate response if you're in such company, not to reveal those great high secrets among any audience. This is the time for smashing Mayavad, for taking your boots and crushing these false, erroneous conceptions, for defending the true and genuine conclusions of the Vedas, not for speaking Ras Lila Katha. So we see here, very elevated, and Srila Prabhupada makes such a beautiful purport. He discusses the different levels of preaching which are to be done, because sometimes it can be a little confusing, and he describes that Mahaprabhu so perfectly models how these different levels of adhikar, these different levels of appropriateness for specific audiences are to be implemented. For the general public, Sankirtan is the most effective method to awaken Krishna consciousness. So here we find for the general public, Sankirtan, the congregational chanting of the holy names, is best. And then if possible, one should discuss the principles enunciated in the Bhagavad Gita. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu followed this principle very strictly and discussed the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita with learned scholars like Sarvabhaum Bhattacharya and Prakashananda Saraswati. So then we see there a higher point when people are more refined, more philosophically educated, then maybe we can begin to speak some philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. You are not this body, Krishna is a person, so on and so forth. And then on a higher level, he taught the principles of the bhakti cult to some students like Sanatana Goswami and Rupa Goswami. So then, when people have become even more refined by understanding these notions of philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, then maybe some conceptions of bhakti may be introduced. But then on the higher level, between very, very intimate devotees like Ramananda Rai, topics like Krishna and the gopis are to be discussed. So for the general populace, however, Sankirtan was very vigorous. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada says, we should follow this general principle, this general standard, this general model for cultivating devotees and for speaking differing levels of things. And then, on that note, about those various levels, we will now begin the Rai Ramananda Samvad. And what do we begin it with? Prabhu kohe, poro shlok shodher nirnoy. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he says, recite a verse from the revealed scriptures, from the Shastra, concerning the ultimate goal of life. This is the first question of the Rai Ramananda Samvad. The Rai Ramananda Samvad is composed of 4 general questions, and each one is delved into. So this is the first one, and it is a very relevant one, and it is a very sweet one, and in many ways it is the most practical for devotees to meditate and hear of. Because this question here, this question is one that we should all know. We should all strive to try to understand this. What is the ultimate goal of life? In many ways, this is what in the Christian tradition is called a catechism. A catechism, if you read them, it's a question and answer format where the question is written and the answer is written. And actually, if you look at old Christian education, the old Christian children, they would, well, they're not old at the time, but the Christian children of yore, they would sit down and they would be able to recite. They would say the question, and then they'll be able to recite the answer. And in that way, through this progressive level of question and answer, question and answer, question and answer, they began to fully understand at least the basics of Christian theology. So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur did something similar, and of course today is the appearance day of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and I was hoping to speak something about him. However, I don't think we will have sufficient time. However, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, greatly following his the general mood he had of taking the great elements of the Western world and finding ways to utilize them, to bring them into the fold of Krishna consciousness. Prior to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, even though there was a very thorough philosophical way of understanding, it was still done within the basic conceptions of a Vedic worldview. People who were still ready to accept the authority of Bhagavatam, of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas. All the people were ready to accept these. The Avaroha Pantha. We know there's two means of knowledge. There's Aroha and there's Avaroha. There is ascending, Aroha, and there's Avaroha, descending. And the descending process is the greater one. Because by that transcendence in all its fullness can come down to our level and nothing is lost. However, the ascending process is the one most commonly done, especially by Western minds. Because there's a certain arrogance, there's a certain desire that I want to figure all these things out. And this one is limited because how far up can we go on the imperfect means of our own reasoning? However, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, especially in his preaching, in the mercy of his mood, we were speaking about how merciful the Vaishnavas are. He gave ways for which those who are so attached to this Aroha way of thinking could in some way be attracted to the path of Krishna consciousness. He himself, accepting perfectly, being a perfect devotee, all the conclusions of the Vedic literature, began to engage in rationalism, if you will. Not engaging in it in the sense that he was endorsing it as a great system, but rather engaging with it in showing that it can be compatible with Krishna consciousness. The Krishna consciousness is not refuted by any philosophical system. This is the highest and most perfect philosophy. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he in this very much mood of bringing in a lot of positive elements of Western influence in order to preach and liberate the westernized minds. In many ways, we say that Srila Prabhupada brought the first Western Vaishnavas. But in many a way, we can say Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was the first Western Vaishnava. And therefore, he is very inspiring. Because even though he was born and raised in India, the education system he was in was so thoroughly run by the British, which was designed as British propaganda, that his mindset was even more heavily westernized than many Indians who grow up in the West today. Very, to use a colloquial term, in terms of his Lila, he was rather whitewashed in his approach to devotion. And of course, that is the pastime he wished to manifest, because he was that great seer, that great visionary who envisioned the Krishna consciousness movement manifesting around the world. That was the choice of his pastime in order to set the groundwork which Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would almost weaponize into the Gauriya Math, and which Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada would then take and spread all around the world. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was that visionary because of that great thing. So anyways, in that mood, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur did a very fascinating thing. He began to write novels. He took a Western form of writing, the novel genre, and decided, here, let Krishna consciousness speak through this as well. Let nothing be independent from the preaching methods of Krishna consciousness. Let nothing be untouched by the Sankirtan mission of Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And so he wrote two main novels, Prema Pradipa and Jaiva Dharma. And Jaiva Dharma is very much written like those catechisms. It's very much written in this question and answer format, which allows a very systematic study of the Vedic literatures, of Krishna Bhakti, and of the highest conceptions of Gauriya Vaishnava Vedanta. So Jaiva Dharma, or Joibo Dharma, because it's a Bengali book. Very sweet book. Everyone should, once they have finished Prabhupada's books 3 times, it is a really sweet book to delve into. So anyway, so this question and answers format is very much recognized as a great tool of teaching. So because of this section here will very, very nicely define for us what is the ultimate goal of life. And it'll begin with Ramananda Rai already beginning with some conceptions of pleasing Vishnu, with some conceptions of bhakti. It cuts to the chase. And Mahaprabhu will progressively reject and reject and reject each answer. Even though each answer is correct, there is a more correct answer. The first few ones are not at all satisfactory. And therefore they're only very partially correct. But even when they become almost fully correct, Mahaprabhu asked for a refined concept, a refined concept, a refined concept. And by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, we'll find in his purports further elaborations, further discussions about why each concept was considered incomplete. And so we will hear what is the first response that Rai Ramananda gives. Rai ko hai shodhurma chorone Vishnu bhakti hoy. If one executes the prescribed duties of his social position, he awakens his original Krishna consciousness. Varnashramachar vata purushena parapuman Vishnur aradhyate pantha nanya tatto shakaranam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Vishnu, is worshipped by the proper execution of prescribed duties in the system of Varna and Ashram. There is no other way to please, to satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One must be situated in the institution of the 4 Varnas and Ashrams. This is a quote from the Vishnu Purana, because of course Mahaprabhu asks, please give some Shastrik Praman, give some evidence for what you are saying. And there is a significance to him asking for evidence. And we'll speak on this point, and then we will speak a little bit more about the significance of Rai Ramananda being Arjun in tomorrow's discussion, because Rai Ramananda will quote Bhagavad Gita a fair bit in this discussion after this quotation of Vishnu Purana. And again, there is a significance to it. It's not just that he randomly decided to speak from Bhagavad Gita. But we do not have time to delve into that satisfactorily. So we will just speak one tiny point. Because every point that Ramananda Rai makes, he gives Shastrik Pramana to justify. Because Mahaprabhu is asked, please, Poro Shloko, speak from the Shloka, speak from the Shastras. Because otherwise it doesn't really matter what people say. Shastras are in one sense, Prabhupada would use this analogy, Shastras are the law books in the courthouse. If one is in a courtroom and they're being held under a legal challenge, say somebody is being accused of murder or something terrible, and then in their defense, one person may say, well, according to this law, this law, this law, and this law, A, the person didn't do it. B, he can't be given this punishment, yada yada. He did not break the law, it was self-defense, something like this. And then another person in the court, he comes along and he says, oh, I just don't think it's fair. I just don't see why I feel that this person should be left off because I feel this way. Or something sentimental like that. We would laugh and we would say, obviously the first justification is a stronger one. The first justification is a better one because he's speaking from the standards and from the authorities. And most of us will have that common sense. But yet when it comes to scriptural and devotional issues, we lose that sense. We value so much our opinions. We value so much sort of random fleeting sentimentalism. Some random sentiment or emotion is held as our pramana. So often, especially with you especially hear in devotional circles, maybe they'll hear some rule, or they'll hear some guidance that have been given by the authorities or by more senior devotees, and they'll say, I don't see how that can affect my devotion. And that's it, done. I don't see how. I don't see why. I don't think this should be done this way. I feel really bad about this issue. So I think this whole thing should be changed. This makes me emotionally uncomfortable. Therefore, what does it matter if this shastric praman? I don't feel comfortable with this. Therefore, I can reject this. I will follow my feelings and my heart. We would laugh at that in a courtroom. We would laugh at that in a legal setting. And yet in a devotional setting, we say, wow, good point. And people are so happy saying, oh, I just don't feel... And then they will go along like this. Such things will not cultivate in any good devotional service. It's blasphemy and disregard for the Vedic literature, and one can only hope to taste a bit of Namaparad following such a path. However, we are lucky that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu does not set the example of such empty sentimentalism. Instead, he says, recite from the revealed scriptures. And in the same way that our understanding so instinctively shows that it is stupid to rely on one's emotional feelings and whims and sentiments in the courtroom, we should also apply that in devotional scenarios. We shouldn't sit down and think, wow, this is really sad. Therefore, I don't want to do this. Wow, this is really difficult. I don't want to do this. I don't see why I should do this. Therefore, I won't. Such thought processes are not endorsed by Mahaprabhu, nor are they endorsed by common sense. Instead, we find here Mahaprabhu so perfectly illustrating exactly the thought process of the devotee who wishes to truly advance in the spiritual path. Not, oh, I see this makes me happy, this makes me sad. No, what does the Shastra, what does the guidance of the authorities, of the sadhus, of Guru, Sadhu, Shastra, what does this tell me? And based on this authority, now what is the proposition to be made? This is the proper mindset. This is the proper means by which we can ascertain the truth. And this is how we are going to so wonderfully find a refinement and a refinement and a refinement until we reach the final goal, the final and highest conception of what the goal of life is. And we will be able to hear so authoritatively, conclusively. And when we finally reach it in this conversation, we can rest upon it and hold on to it with full confidence and faith, because it is spoken from the vantage point of the infinite authority of the Vedic literatures and the pure devotees who have revealed their heart and essence. And on that note, we will continue that discussion and we will begin to hear more of it tomorrow. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki jai, Shri Rai Ramananda ki jai, Shri Krishna Das Kaviraj Thakur ki jai, Shri Caitanya Caritamrita ki jai.